I arrived at the clinic straight from my shift, still wearing the plain uniform I'd earned my living in for decades, while chandeliers glowed above a black-tie fundraiser built inside the very building my wife now ran. I stayed near a column, a small folder bag in my hand, watching donors sip wine and cameras hunt for smiles. Then the chief doctor took the microphone and praised my wife's rise, pausing just long enough to turn my job into a joke. Laughter rippled through the room, polite, rehearsed, cruel. My wife laughed too. She didn't look at me. She didn't correct it. In that moment, something in my life ended quietly. I left without a scene, sat alone in my car, and chose a different kind of response, lawful, documented, inevitable. Before this story unfolds, I need to ask you something personal. If you've ever been humiliated in silence by someone you trusted, please stay with me. Subscribe, not because this is entertainment, but because these stories remind us we're not alone. And if you've lived a moment like this, share it below. Sometimes being heard is the first step towards standing again. Before that night, my life had been ordinary in the way stability often is, quiet, predictable, earned over time. I worked facilities maintenance for the municipal district, the kind of job no one notices unless something breaks. I liked it that way. I knew every corridor by sound, every boiler by smell, every door by the way it resisted before giving in. I fixed what needed fixing and went home without carrying the work with me. There was dignity in that routine, even if it never came with applause. My wife's world had once been just as steady. She started at the clinic as an administrator, careful with budgets, precise with schedules. We shared a small house in the suburbs, raised our older kids to independence, paid bills on time, and learned to live inside a rhythm that didn't demand attention. We were not glamorous, but we were secure. Even our disagreements were measured, resolved before sleep. I believed that counted for something. Then came the pregnancy, late in life, unplanned, fragile. The weeks blurred into appointments and whispered concerns, and eventually into the sterile hum of the NICU. I sat in plastic chairs and watched machines breathe for our child while my wife leaned harder and harder on the clinic's leadership. They became her circle, texts at all hours, dinners labeled as work, reassurance delivered with authority. I was grateful at first. Anyone who steadies your wife when your hands are full feels like a gift. But the rhythm changed. Our kitchen grew quiet. Phones lay face down. Schedules no longer matched shifts. New clothes appeared, tags still on, justified as visibility. At events, I was corrected in public, introduced as an accessory to her ascent. I learned to stand half a step back, smiling when required, listening when not. None of it rose to the level of accusation, it was simply erosion. The gala was supposed to be a celebration of the clinic, not a mirror. I arrived late because my shift ran long. I didn't change because there was nowhere to change. I took my place by a column because I didn't belong at a table. I watched donors network, cameras adjust, leadership circulate. I watched my wife glow under lights that had learned her angles. When the chief doctor joked, it landed because it was framed as affection. It landed because people want permission to laugh. It landed because my wife laughed too. I felt the sound pass through me without heat. Not anger, clarity. The kind that arrives when denial finally lets go. I left before dessert. In my car, the building's windows reflected a version of me that looked smaller than I felt. I didn't rehearse speeches. I didn't text accusations. I opened a notebook and wrote one sentence: act normal. Document everything. Then I drove home and put the notebook where it would wait. Tell me what to adjust, and I'll refine it before moving on. The next morning, I woke at the same time I always had. Coffee measured the same way. Boots by the door. I went to work and replaced a faulty valve in a boiler room that smelled like old metal and patience. I nodded to people who nodded back. I logged hours. I closed tickets. From the outside, nothing changed, and that was the point. Normal is camouflage when you wear it long enough. At home, I made dinner. I asked about the fundraiser in the tone of someone who hadn't been there long enough to matter. My wife talked about donors and optics, about how visibility creates momentum. She didn't mention the joke. She didn't ask why I left early. I noticed how easily the silence arranged itself around us, like furniture that had always been placed that way. I started with records that don't announce themselves. Calendars. Access logs. Vendor lists pinned to shared drives with names that look legitimate until you read them twice. I copied nothing yet. I learned the contours first, who approved what, who benefited from urgency, who liked complexity because it hides hands. I wrote dates in my notebook and matched them to nights labeled work dinners. I wrote nothing that couldn't be verified later. I hired a retired investigator because he understood patience. He didn't promise fireworks. He promised timelines. He asked for permission to be boring and accurate. I gave it. He worked hotel lobbies and weekday gaps. He worked cameras that don't blink. When he called, he spoke in measurements, entrances, exits, durations. The pattern formed without drama. I added a forensic accountant because money tells the truth when people don't. Purchase orders that didn't match deliveries. Shell vendors that shared addresses. Funds routed through departments that had recently expanded authority. Everything documented, timestamped, sourced. I stored copies off-site and indexed the chain the way a mechanic labels parts before disassembly. Nothing loose. Nothing loud. At night, I sat with the youngest child asleep down the hall and scheduled a paternity test without ceremony. I chose a lab that knew how to keep its voice down. The result arrived as a line of text that didn't accuse anyone, it simply answered a question. I filed it with the packet and closed the folder. I met with a lawyer who spoke in margins and contingencies. Trusts for the older kids. Separation planning that protected routines. Custody language that centered stability, not punishment. We prepared filings to be served during business hours, traceable and clean. Process servers, certified routing, indexed exhibits. I kept living as if none of it existed. The clinic announced another fundraiser. Bigger. Brighter. I circled the date and practiced being ordinary. Normal takes practice. I got very good at it. Preparation has a sound to it. Not the rustle of paper or the click of keys, but the quieter noise of alignment, pieces finding their places without force. I kept my days narrow and my nights precise. I learned when the clinic's hallways emptied, when approvals piled up because no one wanted to be the bottleneck. I learned which vendors thrived on ambiguity and which panicked when asked for confirmations in writing. The investigators' reports arrived weekly, thin folders that grew heavier by pattern, not volume. Hotel names repeated. Weekday gaps aligned with leadership offsites. The entries never editorialized. Dates, times, entrances. The absence of coincidence did the talking. I thanked him once and asked him to keep going. He nodded like a man who understands that momentum is fragile. The accountant mapped money the way surveyors map land, lines, elevations, ownership. He found orders that arrived light and billed heavy, services that existed only on paper, and a small constellation of shell vendors that orbited the same decision-makers. The routes converged near my wife's expanded authority and the chief doctor's discretionary lanes. I didn't feel triumph. I felt confirmation. There's a difference. I created redundancy because truth deserves backups. Copies lived where they couldn't be reached by curiosity or panic. Each document logged with source notes and timestamps, each exhibit indexed so a stranger could follow the trail without me in the room. I rehearsed handing it over to people who had no reason to care about my marriage. At home, I stayed mild. I listened to talk about optics and growth. I watched new wardrobe pieces cycle through their debut. I answered questions about my day with fewer details than before, not out of secrecy but economy. The distance between us became a hallway neither of us acknowledged. When the clinic announced the next fundraiser, the tone shifted, more donors, more media, more screens. I walked the building on my lunch break and noticed where sound traveled and where it didn't. Where cameras favored faces and where cables pooled. I learned which microphone was the backup and who controlled the switch. The lawyer finalized service dates. Business hours. Receipts. No surprises. I signed where I needed to sign and felt nothing dramatic, only the relief of a plan that no longer needed me to carry it alone. That night, I parked outside the clinic and watched staff filter out under banners that promised care and excellence. I sat with the engine off and counted breaths until my hands were steady. Leverage isn't a threat. It's a fact disclosed at the right time. And time, finally, was learning to wait for me. I didn't rush the filings. Rushing turns clean lines into smudges. We waited for a weekday when offices hum and nothing feels personal. The process server confirmed times with the precision of a metronome. Receipts came back stamped and boring, exactly as they should be. Divorce paperwork delivered to my wife's office. Evidence packets queued for the clinic board and compliance. Oversight bodies added in the order my lawyer recommended. Each delivery traceable. Each exhibit indexed. I signed the last cover sheet and went back to work. At the clinic, the mood lifted without me. The next fundraiser promised expansion and benevolence, a choreography rehearsed by people who believe applause is proof. I kept acting normal. I fixed a door that wouldn't latch. I replaced a flickering ballast. I logged the work and washed my hands. The night of the event, I arrived early and stood where sound carried to screens and microphones shared power. I wasn't hidden, I was simply unremarkable. When recognition came, it wasn't loud, just enough. I didn't raise my voice. I presented exhibits the way you present weather, dates, routes, transactions, a test result that answered a question no one asked out loud. Phones lifted. Laughter thinned. The room learned a new posture. Then I disclosed the operational fact that made everything else inevitable. The property sat inside an LLC I controlled. The lease would not renew under current terms. It wasn't a threat. It was a calendar. Security moved late. Board members moved fast. Damage control has a sound too, paper sliding, whispers hardening. Afterward, enforcement did what enforcement does when documentation arrives complete. Meetings became urgent. Titles loosened. The chief doctor's certainty evaporated. My wife's standing collapsed the way borrowed scaffolding does when it's pulled from beneath you. The divorce progressed without theater, terms written to protect routines and children first. I kept my job. I kept my hours. I transitioned tenants and leases as planned. I funded scholarships quietly, the way you fix things that don't need to know your name. The youngest child's stability mattered more than any headline. Peace returned in increments, the way silence does after machinery shuts down. Justice didn't arrive with cheers. It arrived with order. And that was enough. What surprised me most wasn't the speed of the fallout, but how little noise it made once the machinery engaged. There were no shouting matches in hallways, no dramatic exits captured for later replay. Institutions don't unravel with screams, they do it with emails marked urgent, meetings pulled forward, and doors that stop opening when you knock. I watched it happen from the margins, where I had always stood, and felt a strange gratitude for the distance. At home, the air changed before words did. Papers sat where they were placed. A suitcase appeared, then disappeared. Conversations shortened into logistics, times, access, the child's schedule, spoken as if tone could bruise something already tender. I answered carefully and recorded nothing new. The work was done. Anything added now would only feed the wrong appetite. I kept my routine because routine is ballast. Morning coffee. Boots by the door. The hum of systems that respond when you treat them right. I took calls from my lawyer and returned them promptly. I didn't check headlines. I didn't scroll for reactions. Justice that depends on attention isn't justice, it's theater. I had chosen the other thing. The youngest child slept, woke, slept again. Stability is built from repetitions no one applauds. I learned the weight of that responsibility the way you learn weather, by feeling pressure shift before the storm arrives. Guardianship language did its work. The calendar settled into something predictable. The clinic building looked the same from the outside. Banners came down. A different logo went up. Tenants adjust. Cities do this every day. I transitioned leases and handed keys to people who will never know why the terms changed. They don't need to. Outcomes don't owe explanations to bystanders. Some evenings, I sat in my car where I had once decided to be patient and let the quiet hold me. I didn't feel victorious. I felt finished. There's a difference. When you've been reduced to a punchline and choose order instead of noise, the reward isn't applause. It's the return of your own voice, low and steady, telling you to go home. Time didn't rush back in the way people promise it will. It returned slowly, like a system coming online after maintenance, one circuit at a time, lights testing themselves before committing to brightness. I learned to live inside that pace. I stopped measuring days by what had happened and started measuring them by what didn't. I was still addressed by my first name at work, still handed keys and access cards without ceremony. The boilers didn't care about my marriage. The doors didn't remember the gala. Things either worked or they didn't, and when they didn't, I fixed them. There is comfort in tasks that answer honestly. The older kids checked in more often than before. Not with questions, just presence. Short calls. Shared updates. They didn't ask for details, and I didn't offer them. Trust grows when you don't make it carry weight it didn't ask for. The trusts did their quiet work. Futures stayed intact. The youngest child learned new rhythms. Morning steadied. Bedtimes held. I became careful about promises, choosing only the ones I could keep without explanation. Stability, I learned, isn't a feeling, it's a schedule you honor even when you're tired. Occasionally, someone would try to draw me back into the story as spectacle. A look held too long. A question framed as concern. I answered with facts that led nowhere interesting. Curiosity loses interest when it can't find drama to eat. That was a skill I didn't know I had learned. At night, I sometimes thought about the man by the column, the uniform, the folder bag, the joke that landed because permission was given. I didn't resent him. He had done the only thing he could do at the time, observe. Observation, it turns out, is a form of strength when paired with patience. I began funding small scholarships without announcements, choosing trades and programs that build things you can touch. I liked the idea of usefulness multiplying quietly. I signed leases and walked properties and kept notes that would matter later to people I might never meet. Life narrowed into something clean. Fewer explanations. Fewer performances. More work done well and left behind without signature. The noise receded, not because it was defeated, but because it was no longer invited. There's a point after disruption when the world stops asking how you're doing and starts assuming you're fine. I reached that point without noticing. No one checked in anymore. No one angled for a quote. The silence wasn't abandonment, it was permission. I took it. I sold nothing in anger. I changed nothing out of spite. Every adjustment followed the same rule I'd used at work for years: improve reliability, reduce risk. Leases were rewritten with clearer terms. Maintenance schedules tightened. Contingencies built in where optimism used to sit. I learned to appreciate systems that don't require belief to function. The youngest child grew taller in small increments. Shoes wore out. A favorite cup cracked and was replaced with another just like it. These were the victories I paid attention to. I learned that presence isn't about being impressive, it's about being predictable. I showed up when I said I would. I left when it was time. I didn't disappear. Once, in a grocery store aisle, I ran into someone who had been at the gala. There was an apology that tried to be light, a laugh that didn't land. I nodded, wished them well, and moved on to the bread. The past is heavy only if you insist on carrying it into every room. I kept the notebook for a while after everything settled. Not to relive it, but to remember the discipline it required. Eventually, I put it in a box with manuals and warranties, documents for things that had served their purpose. The lesson stayed without the paper. On quiet evenings, I sat on the porch and listened to the neighborhood settle. Dogs being called in. Garage doors closing. Ordinary endings to ordinary days. I thought about how close I'd come to choosing noise instead of order, and how little it would have changed if I had. Strength isn't louder when it's real. It's steadier. I didn't become someone new. I returned to who I had always been, with fewer illusions and better boundaries. The world didn't owe me an apology, and I didn't need one. I had my routines, my work, and a life that fit again. That was enough. I used to believe turning points arrived with force, raised voices, slammed doors, moments that announced themselves. What I learned instead is that life bends on small decisions made consistently. The choice to leave early. The choice to write one sentence in a notebook. The choice to keep acting normal when every instinct wants relief. In the months after everything settled, I noticed how my body responded to calm. Shoulders lowered. Breathing slowed. I slept through the night without replaying conversations that never happened. The mind is kinder when it isn't busy defending itself. Work continued to offer its simple proofs. When a system failed, there was a reason. When it worked, it did so quietly. I trained a younger technician who asked careful questions and listened when answers came without flourish. I showed him how to label wires and why redundancy matters. He thanked me once, awkwardly, and went back to work. That felt right. At home, I pared things down. Fewer objects. Clear surfaces. I kept what served a purpose and let the rest go without ceremony. Letting go doesn't need witnesses. It needs resolve. The youngest child learned to trust the day. That's what children do when adults keep their promises. I learned to trust myself the same way. I stopped rehearsing explanations for choices I'd already made. People who need explanations will ask. Most don't. Once, I found myself parked outside the clinic again, not for a decision this time, but because the route took me past it. The building looked smaller than it used to. Not diminished, just placed. I drove on. There's a freedom that comes when your life fits your values without adjustment. No audience required. No punchlines tolerated. Just the steady satisfaction of choices aligned and maintained. I didn't win anything. I kept what mattered. There was a time when I measured myself against rooms, how I was received, where I stood, whether I belonged. That habit fell away without effort once I stopped needing permission. Belonging, I learned, isn't granted by a microphone or withheld by a joke. It's claimed by consistency. I answered to fewer people after everything ended. My lawyer, when deadlines mattered. My supervisor, when systems needed attention. The youngest child, when a promise had a time attached to it. The rest became background noise, present, harmless, easy to ignore. I rebuilt trust the same way I fix a failing system: identify the load, remove strain, add support where it counts. I didn't overcorrect. Overcorrection creates its own failures. I chose modest improvements that would hold under pressure. They did. Some evenings, I cooked without distraction and ate at the table instead of standing at the counter. I read manuals for things I didn't own yet, because understanding how something works makes it less intimidating when it arrives. I planned trips measured in hours, not spectacle. I learned which roads felt calm at night and took them even when they weren't the fastest. The youngest child asked simple questions that deserved simple answers. I gave them. When questions grew complicated, I said I'd come back with a better explanation later, and then I did. Trust compounds when follow-through is boringly reliable. I stopped rehearsing conversations with people who were no longer part of my days. Closure doesn't require consensus. It requires a decision to stop visiting old rooms. If I had to name the change, I'd say this: I began living as if my life was a small operation worth running well. Clear roles. Clean records. No theatrics. When problems appeared, I addressed them early and quietly. When things worked, I let them work. I don't think about the gala anymore unless someone asks me how I learned to be patient. Then I say what's true: patience wasn't the virtue. Precision was. And precision begins with knowing who you answer to. Now, the answer is simple. There came a morning when I realized I was no longer correcting my own memories. I wasn't replaying scenes to soften them or sharpen them. They had settled into their proper scale, important because they taught me something, unimportant because they no longer asked anything of me. That's when I knew the work was done. I kept notes for practical reasons now. Maintenance logs. Lease reminders. School dates. The habit remained, but the edge was gone. Documentation no longer felt like armor, it felt like stewardship. You keep records when you intend to stay. The youngest child began to mirror calm. Not obedience, calm. The difference matters. Calm grows when the ground doesn't shift under your feet. I watched it happen and adjusted my own pace to match. Faster isn't better if it leaves someone behind. I learned which apologies to accept and which to decline by not responding. Silence can be generous when it refuses to reopen old contracts. I didn't need reconciliation with people who preferred versions of me that fit their rooms. I needed alignment with the life I was actually living. Some nights, I thought about how easily everything could have gone the other way. A confrontation inside the ballroom. Words chosen for heat instead of accuracy. The temporary relief of noise. It would have satisfied an urge and cost me the result. I was glad I had waited long enough to choose differently. I started volunteering a few hours a month at a trade school, nothing formal, just helping students understand how buildings behave when they're treated right. I told them the truth: most work is invisible, and that's fine. If you do it well, people feel safe without knowing why. That's the job. The past didn't vanish. It took its place behind me, where it belonged. When it surfaced, it did so without sting. Memory, finally, had stopped arguing. People talk about winning as if it announces itself, confetti, headlines, a clean ending. What I learned is that a quiet win measures itself over time. It shows up in bills paid without anxiety, mornings that begin without bracing, evenings that end without regret. It's cumulative, not cinematic. I watched seasons change without tying them to milestones. Leaves fell. Systems cycled. The youngest child learned to read rooms the way children do, by sensing safety first. I made sure safety was present more often than not. When mistakes happened, we corrected them without shame. Repair, done early, prevents stories you don't want to tell later. At work, I was offered a supervisory role and declined. Not out of bitterness, out of fit. I prefer hands-on problems with clear answers. I prefer being useful without being visible. The decision surprised a few people. It didn't surprise me. I kept my financial life conservative. No gestures. No sudden upgrades. I maintained buffers the way you maintain pressure in a system, enough to absorb shocks without drawing attention. When asked for advice, I offered principles instead of prescriptions. Clarity beats cleverness. Once, a donor who had laughed at the gala crossed my path at a community event. There was an attempt at warmth, a memory tested for permission. I returned courtesy without intimacy. The past is a reference, not a residence. I realized then that dignity isn't restored by exposure. It's restored by coherence, by living in a way that makes sense to you even when no one's watching. The man I had been at the back of the room hadn't lacked dignity, he had lacked leverage. The man I was now didn't need either. The win wasn't that others learned something. The win was that I did, and kept it. I stopped thinking of the whole thing as a chapter with an ending. It felt more accurate to call it training. Not the kind that hardens you, but the kind that refines your sense of weight, what to lift, what to leave where it lies. I carried forward fewer assumptions and more patience, and both proved lighter than I expected. The youngest child began asking questions about work, why buildings need care, why things fail when they're ignored. I answered with examples you can see, a hinge that squeaks before it breaks, a filter that clogs before a motor burns out. We talked about attention as a form of respect. Not everything needs saving, but everything worth keeping needs tending. I kept my circle small. A couple of coworkers who knew when to talk and when to let silence do its job. A neighbor who waved without curiosity. Family dinners that ended early enough for bedtime routines to hold. I didn't chase replacements for what had been lost. I made room for what fit. There were days when the old reflex stirred, the urge to explain myself to people who weren't listening. I recognized it and let it pass. You don't owe clarity to an audience that prefers confusion. You owe it to yourself. I organized the box of documents one last time and archived it properly. Not because I feared the past returning, but because preparedness is a habit I trust. Then I labeled it simply and stored it where it wouldn't interrupt my days. Tools belong on shelves, not on tables. I found satisfaction in maintenance that prevented emergencies. In plans that worked without heroics. In a life that didn't require me to stand by columns or wait for permission to take up space. I took up space by doing what needed doing and leaving rooms better than I found them. If there's a lesson worth passing on, it's this: you don't need to be loud to be decisive. You need to be accurate. Accuracy holds. Noise fades. I carried that forward, and it carried me. The final adjustments didn't announce themselves. They arrived the way the last steps of a repair do, tightening, testing, then stepping back to see if anything rattled. Nothing did. The divorce reached its conclusion without surprises. Terms held. Schedules worked. The youngest child's days remained intact, which mattered more than how anything looked on paper. I signed the last document with the same pen I used for maintenance logs and felt the symmetry of it. Some tools serve every part of your life if you let them. I transitioned the remaining leases and closed the loop on the LLC the way you close a project: confirm deliverables, hand off cleanly, archive responsibly. New tenants moved in. Old signage disappeared. The building returned to being just a building. That was as it should be. At work, a winter storm tested systems across the district. Pipes threatened. Power flickered. Radios crackled with updates. I worked a long shift with people who knew what they were doing and didn't need speeches to do it. We stabilized what could be stabilized and documented what couldn't. When the storm passed, the city exhaled without knowing why. That's the kind of contribution I've always preferred. One evening, the youngest child fell asleep mid-sentence while telling me about something important that would matter tomorrow. I carried them to bed and stood in the doorway longer than necessary, listening to breathing slow. There are moments you don't frame or share. You just keep them. I realized then that I hadn't checked my phone for validation in months. I hadn't rehearsed explanations or imagined confrontations. My days belonged to me again. Not because I'd taken them back from anyone, but because I'd stopped giving them away. The past no longer required maintenance. The present did, and I was good at that. The last thing to settle wasn't legal or financial. It was internal, the moment I stopped scanning rooms for where I belonged and realized I already knew. Belonging, it turns out, isn't assigned. It's maintained. My days became smaller in the best way. Fewer moving parts. Fewer explanations. I woke, worked, returned home, and repeated the cycle with care. The youngest child grew within that predictability, learning that the world responds when you treat it consistently. I watched that lesson take root and felt a quiet pride that didn't need witnesses. Sometimes I pass buildings I've worked on years ago. I know which doors still swing true and which probably need attention by now. I don't stop to check. I trust the systems I left behind. That trust feels like a kind of legacy, useful, anonymous, intact. I no longer think about the gala as a wound. It's a reference point, nothing more. A reminder of the night I chose not to speak because I planned to act. The joke didn't define me. My response did. If there's an ending to this, it's not a scene. It's a condition. Peace that holds under ordinary pressure. Dignity that doesn't require defense. A life that fits the man living it. I keep the lights on. I keep the doors working. I keep my promises. And when the day is done, I go home knowing that nothing I built depends on applause to stand. That's enough.